Hello and welcome to today's short webinar on how to ask questions. My name is Laura, and I will guide you through today's tips and tricks on what to think about when you're about to shoot a question, whether it's in general or in and frankly. And speaking of questions, if you have one, you're more than welcome to write them in the little speech bubble. And I will try to answer them either during the presentation or take them afterwards. And you can write them in English or in Swedish, and I'll do my best to translate them. So, we are all here today to get a bit of a better understanding on the huge topic that is to ask a good question. But no, today we will not dig into trying to create the universal question to give us all answers. This webinar is to give you some inspiration and encourage you to keep on asking questions. Every day we ask a bunch of questions to get a better understanding on different things. And those of you who have been around kids have probably noticed that they will ask you why at least 10 times a day as a way to getting to know how the world functions. And they're just trying to make sense of all of it, as we all are at some extent. So this webinar is to hopefully give you some more inspiration and encourage you to keep on asking questions. Questions are the natural path for development, and even if we're all acquainted with them, there are a few things to keep in mind to make sure we really capture the right purpose and target the right audience. So, what is the purpose of asking questions in your workplace? Well, usually you ask questions to find out the answers, but it's not always really that simple. You might ask a question to get a starting point and check the status of your team. For example, are the team's goals clear to you, or are you looking forward to going to work? It's a simple question that can give you so much to work with. Or it could be to initiate a dialogue. For example, how do you feel stepping into your job? These kind of questions open up for discussions on different areas you might want to develop, change, or maybe keep in the same high level. And we also have questions to trigger actions and self-reflection. It can be used as small reminders and as a little room for thought of something that you and your team have decided you should act upon, and you need a little nudging to remember them in your everyday work life. And you can also, of course, ask questions to follow up and seeing if you are on track regarding your goals. In any way, questions are a great tool to create engagement in the team through questions on how you experience your work situation or your workplace. You are encouraged to get involved on how you can improve and develop. So no matter the reason, there are a few guidelines worth keeping in mind when you're about to ask a question to your team members or employees. And there's actually a very simple way to remember it. You can keep your questions frank. A question that you're about to ask should be focused, relevant, actionable, natural, and almost most important of all, you should keep it simple. So, when you're about to phrase a question or send out a package, think about beginning with the end in mind. What's the purpose of this question or package? And how will I or how will we use the answers? And by focusing on a certain topic at a time, you will be able to communicate a clear purpose of the survey and get relevant answers that you can work with. So let's take an example. It's easy to get excited by the possibilities and the power of questions, and that's a good thing. It means that you're curious and you're ready to make improvements. And at the same time, you might want to give your managers and yourself the opportunity to give a thorough follow-up on the areas you ask about. So let's say that you start with a KPI on engagement. That's great. And then you would like to see how you're doing in leadership. And recognition is, of course, very important. Maybe let's add a motivational package as well to acknowledge the employee's good job. But are well-being, leadership, and recognition, and then motivation really areas that you easily can work through together in 1 month? Or are you maybe trying to catch a little too many flies in a bang? It could also look like this. You can measure your engagement KPI, and if you want to take a closer look into, say, leadership, you can schedule it, maybe once as a starting point and once as a follow-up to see if you have improved. And then you can keep the well-being pulse once a month just to look at what you can improve in your team on a more daily basis. Next is relevant. Asking questions in the right context and that are connected to the situation you are in is really important to get a helpful and thoughtful answer. A relevant question to ask your coworkers or employees might imply their work day, work situation, or health related to work, or a specific state you are in or an area that you're working on. So, for example, if you're going through an organizational change, ask a question about that. Or did you decide to work on feedback in the team? Perfect. Go ahead and see how you're doing in that topic. And an irrelevant question on the other side could be asking for personal information or something that is unrelated. So ask yourself if the question you're thinking of is related to your situation and work. And ask appropriate questions within your context that make sense here and now, and that you actually can do something about. The A stands for actionable. To stay within your circle of influence when you ask a question can really help you involve the team and increase commitment. So ask about things that you can actually impact you as a leader or together with your team. Actionable can mean several things and can be based on different levels. It can mean that your organization as a whole takes action on a topic important to you as a company. It can mean that your team together takes action on outcomes from your discussions that you want to change or develop. Could be either reinforce a good behavior or encourage some new ones. But an actionable question can also imply self-reflection and self-leadership. And in those cases, you can choose topics that the individuals have the opportunity and power to change themselves. And an example of staying within your circle of influence can be, for instance, during the last week, have you helped someone in your team or gotten help from someone in your team? That's something that you definitely can influence yourself, as opposed to the travel distance between your team members and the office. Here's another example of actionable questions for the individual. during the week have you given a colleague feedback, or I have openly discussed mistakes with my colleagues in order to learn from them. N stands for natural. So write your questions in the same language as you usually communicate on a daily basis. Express yourself in a familiar way to encourage trust, and you can avoid jargons or the kind of language that can intimidate or discourage people, that makes them feel left out. So if you're asking questions to a small group of technicians, for instance, well, the niche technical concepts or terms are totally fine. In another case, try to generalize the language a little bit to fit the ones answering your questions. So, for example, have you shared some of our content in social media? That could be a general question, as opposed to, did you like our last pic on Insta? Which is a little bit more directed to a certain kind of employees or a certain team. And keep the language not too formal. The question works just fine if you ask, are you okay with the suggested driving limits? As opposed to, do you acknowledge the proposed cap for automotive travel frequency? And last, but very much not least, try to keep it simple. It's common to think that once you have the chance to ask a question, you should really use it and ask about everything. We don't really think that's necessarily right. So start with one question, and you can always follow up with another one or discuss it in the team. We encourage that. And always ask about just one idea at a time. If you ask multiple areas in the same question, it makes it hard both for your respondents to answer and very difficult for you to interpret their answers correctly. So, for example, I can see positive effects of the change. It gives a great base for further discussions and follow-up questions, as opposed to, with regards to the organizational change that we're currently going through, do you feel energized by the activities that? And then, and frankly, actually runs out of letters. But by the time you get there, you really don't have that much energy. Or another example of a double-barreled questions that you might avoid. And in Unfrankly, you can actually ask one question with two parameters where you can easily see in the same topic what works and what needs to be better. But you should avoid questions like how interesting and structure is the presentation. And instead ask two questions saying how interesting was the presentation and how structured was the presentation. So together, these are 5 short guidelines on how you can start developing your way of asking questions. And remember to keep your questions focused, relevant, actionable, natural, and of course, keep it simple. Keep them frank. And as most things, it's also a learning process where you will find your ways of communication and areas of focus together with your team. And some of you may be wondering, do I need to keep this in mind at all times? And of course not. In Unfrankly, we have a whole library of questions, 217 to be exact, to guide you through. And don't worry getting lost in the myriad of questions. You can filter the library using tags that are now updated and fresh. And well, after feedback from you. So just go into your accounts under Start and Questions and Library, and you will find both questions that are follow-up questions, in-depth questions, or action questions. And if you are curious for some more tips on do's and don'ts, we also gathered some bullet points and good examples in a short guide that you also find in your and Frankly accounts under Starts and Guides. So we really hope that this webinar will inspire you to start asking more questions. And in the end, the purpose is to initiate a dialogue and involve your employees. And looking back again at the kids constantly asking questions, they really do manage to learn quite a lot in a very short time. So just start asking or keep on asking questions.